right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second concurrent session of the day. Why are there no presentations about rainbows? How to create a visually interesting yet accessible presentation. Now, our presenters today are Kristen White and Crystal Trapani from Old Dominion University. Crystal is an instructional technologist for the Center for Learning and Adjunct Instruction with the Department of English. She has crafted several innovative and accessible tech-forward activities for her composition courses, which she has shared with faculty. Kristen is also an instructional technologist with the Center for Learning and Technology at ODU. She helped facilitate the school's online transition during COVID-19, and she continues to support faculty through workshops and documentation. Now, if you have any questions at all during the presentation, please feel free to submit those in the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom room screen. We'll make sure that we'll at least be able to address those at the end of the talk. And on that note, I will go ahead and hand it over to our presenters.
Thank you, Shriver. So as Shriver mentioned, today we're going to be talking about why are there no presentations about rainbows and how to make visually interesting yet accessible presentations. I'm going to throw in the chat for you a link in case you are interested in viewing these at the same time, and Crystal beat me to it, or you can use the QR code that is also being shared on your screen. So that's just a link to the presentation itself, and it will also be posted with the recording for Hawks. All right, so today we are going to be focusing on multiple objectives about accessibility, and we want you to recognize that it is important not to just think about accessibility after the fact. It's often more difficult to fix items in your content than to start with them in mind. We want you to be able to identify accessibility standards. There are very common ones we're going to be going over today, so that you can also add that into your own content creation, sorry about that, and then be able to differentiate and distinguish between different fonts and what are appropriate fonts to choose, as well as understand what color contrast is and how to generate color palettes that are accessible. And then we'll also be reviewing different accessibility tools that most of you have at your fingertips already.
All right, so when you start thinking about accessibility, it's actually not about disability at all. Accessibility is about ability and making things easier for everyone. And odds are you rely on things that are accessibility things in your daily life. When you go to the grocery store, you walk through the automatic doors, and when you go to leave, you take your cart to the curb cut to go to your car. When you're watching a movie, you don't want to wake somebody in the next room, so you might turn on the subtitles. And if you've ever read an audiobook, that's how many people with disabilities complete their entire degree programs. And really, everyone should benefit from your content. There's several different types of disability, but the four main types are visibility, which includes those who have no vision or low vision, and they might be using screen readers or high contrast settings or screen magnifiers. And document structure is really going to help these individuals. Audibility includes those who have low hearing or no hearing. Narration or video is often difficult for these individuals, and so you want to make sure you're adding captions and subtitles to your documents. And if you're doing a presentation, a sign language interpreter should be included, or some sort of captioning service, as you don't know who is hard of hearing or deaf in the audience. There's actually two types of mobility, and the first is physical mobility, and that's the one that people think of the most, and that's that loss of range of motion. People think of that so much the most that when you Google to look for an image about disability, you always get an older individual in a wheelchair, but obviously disability extends far beyond that. The second is electronic mobility, and this is the ability to review documents across multiple devices and have them appear the same no matter where someone is looking at it. Finally, the last one is cognition, and this is that mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experiences, and senses. However, it's important to remember that any institution that receives any sort of federal funding is required by federal law to maintain and provide accessible documents. And I'm sure probably a majority of the people here today are working in education in some way, so you are probably needing to meet those guidelines. Section 508 requires institutions to provide accessible content to students of all learning abilities. It aims to make websites, web apps, electronic documents, and software accessible to everyone. And the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which you might hear called WCAG 2.0, is the most current guidelines. They have level A, AA, and AAA, but the refreshed 508, section 508 specifically mentions levels A and AA. And any content you deliver to students through a digital method, be it email, Blackboard, Canvas, Google Docs, Google Classrooms, doesn't matter. Whatever, if you're looking at it on a computer screen, basically, or your phone screen or a tablet, it must meet 508 standards. And one of the common things we hear is, well, why do I need to make my content accessible? I don't have any students with disabilities. And while this might be the case now, you may easily have a student later who does have accommodation paperwork. And the reality is getting accommodations is very expensive. There's lots of doctor's visits and testing, and there's a whole process to go through. And so for some students, accommodations is financially impossible for them. We have, particularly those of us who work in higher ed, we sometimes have students who went through all of K-12 having accommodations of some sort, a 504, an IEP, and they get to college and they're like, well, I want to try it without. And so if your content's already accessible, you're actually going to be helping those students, whether they knew you're doing it or not. There also might be cultural or familiar barriers. While your students might not need accommodations, someone in their home might. And so a student who's colorblind might think that they don't need or can't get an accommodation, but they would certainly be at a great disadvantage if your course content doesn't meet those color contrast standards. You also have students who are, like I said, having trouble getting that paperwork because not only do they have to make all these appointments to get it, they also have to get it through the appropriate channels at wherever you are. And if you think your students aren't using accessibility tools, there was a large scale study done in 2014 that found that even though none of the students studied had an auditory difference, nearly all of them used closed captions. And so that's something to think about, is that even though you might not have a student or an individual who has that paperwork, the odds are they are using those things. And so a quote we like to give out is from Corinne Gray of Uncomfortable Revolution. And she says, if you embrace diversity, but ignore disability, you're doing it wrong. And so that's something certainly to consider. You have to include every voice at the table. And if you're claiming to be fully diverse and you're not willing to accept individuals with disabilities, you are not being diverse. And like we said, accessible course content is required under federal law, and many schools have been sued for non-compliance. And you don't want to become a statistic, because the moment you put anything in that digital space, it must meet those web accessibility standards. If it doesn't, you are opening yourself up to litigation. Accessibility compliance is like speeding, and ignorance of the law or the speed limit is not going to help you out. And finally, it's simply common courtesy. If you see somebody struggling to open the door because their hands are full, you're probably going to feel inclined to hold the door for them. You should think of accessibility in that case also. A lot of people, it kind of takes a mind shift to think about as, oh, that accessibility thing, that's the thing I have to do. But you want to change it to the mindset of accessibility is just another piece of when I create some sort of document to share with my students. And so with all of that in mind, there is this myth that accessible means boring. And this is not the case at all. A fully accessible slide deck can be visually appealing to a typically abled user. However, it can also be fully accessible with some measures in mind. And your slide deck can be just as colorful as a humble frog playing his banjo in a swamp singing about rainbows.
So the first thing to think about, because this is a starting point for most presentations, when you're building your slide deck, you should actually be starting with your master slides or theme builder. In Microsoft PowerPoint, this is called master slides. In Google Slides, this is called theme builder. This slide deck runs in the background of your program. So it's already populated with all of the formatting, and this helps you to make sure that your slides are consistent in style. Additionally, when you're crafting the master slides, you're going to be putting placeholders in for text, titles, objects, and elements. And this helps signify to a screen reader what part of the slide is being read. If you simply format text to look like a title versus putting it into the title placeholder, a screen reader does not know that that text is actually meant to be the slide's title. You should be using the layouts that are built into the slide master versus making a layout on your own on a blank slide. This can also impact reading order, which is a whole nother thing. And it's important to note that there are more placeholder capabilities in PowerPoint than in Google Slides. And this is something you need to be cognizant of, as you won't be able to adjust the reading order in Google Slides without something called an add-on like Grackle. So now let's take a look at color contrast. Have you ever struggled to match a pair of socks like black and navy blue socks and just needed a better light to tell the difference? Imagine not being able to get the better light to tell what color something is. Someone who experiences a form of color blindness may see the world differently from you. Additionally, a student who has low vision may override your document colors to view them in a color combination that works best for them. Color contrast is the difference between the background color and foreground color. Your background color is the color that is on the page. So for instance, when you open a Google Doc or a Microsoft Word document, it automatically defaults to a white background. The foreground color is the color of the text or images that are being put on top of that background. So again, a Google Doc or Microsoft Word document will automatically default to black text, which would be considered the foreground. Color contrast is often expressed as a contrast ratio that ranges from 1 to 21 and is written as 1:1, which would be white text on a white background, or 21:1 or 21:1, which would be black text on a white background. The first number in the ratio refers to the relative luminance of light colors, and the second number refers to the relative luminance of the dark colors. So if the text and background colors are swapped, the contrast ratio remains the same. So if you had white font on a black background, it's still going to be 21:1. In order to meet the Web Content Accessibility Guideline Level A or AA standards, which is the minimum requirement, the visual representation of both text, smaller than 18-point font, and images must have a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1. And if you're using larger text, such as 18-point font, or if you're using bold, 14-point or larger, it requires a 3:1 contrast ratio. It's important to note that you cannot round up when considering contrast. So a contrast ratio of 4.48 to 1 does not meet the minimum contrast requirements of 4.5 to 1. WCAG 2.0 AAA guidelines require a minimum contrast ratio of 7:1 for the visual representation of the smaller text, so smaller than 18-point font and images, or for large text, that 18-point font or larger, or 14-point for bold, requires 3.5 contrast ratio. But why is that important? The background colors may be perceived differently by users with visual impairments, and those with cognitive differences may have difficulty reading text at certain contrast levels. When considering contrast, navigating the course content gets a lot more difficult if contrast standards aren't met. While many colors may look fine to the average user, they might be impossible for someone who has color blindness. If you ask a colorblind student to identify a red bar on a chart, they will not be able to complete this task in many cases. This is why color should never be the only indicator when used to identify something. Now, how do you know what color is being used? Colors are identified in several ways depending on which program you're using. And it's not important for you to understand how the complexities of how these colors are actually generated on the screen. It is important for you to recognize the different types of displays so you're able to either remediate or generate your own documents. They can be represented in one of three ways. The first is hexadecimal, also known as hex code, and that presents colors as a combination of 6 letters and numbers. When a color is presented in hex format, it starts with a hash and is followed by characters. So the first example on this slide is purple, and the hexadecimal would be hash 4B0082. Another way it can be expressed is RGB, the amount of red, green, and blue that generates a color. And this is presented as a series of 3 numbers. So purple, the same color, would be represented in RGB as 75, 0, 130. And the last way it might be represented is called HSL, known as hue, saturation, and lightness, and are related to how people actually perceive colors. This is presented as a degree followed by 2 percentages. So for purple, it is 274.6 degrees, 100%, and 25.5%. Well, you don't need to know how these numbers are generated. It is important to recognize that the way that, or the different ways that they can be displayed, so you can access that color information from the program you're using to ensure you are using accessible color palettes. So now here is an example of 3 different colors. We have pure red, pure blue, and pure green, all with the representative numbers or codes for the hex, RG, and RGB. And the first one is pure red. You'll notice that the ratio is 3.99 to 1. This does technically meet WCAG double A level for large text because this is 18 point font, but many people use red text in a smaller size than 18, and that actually does not meet contrast and is often hard on even your average user's eyes. The middle one, pure blue, exceeds the 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio with a ratio of 8.6 to 1. And the pure green at the bottom on the white does not meet the minimum contrast ratio of 4 to 1 and has a contrast ratio of 1.4 to 1. And now Crystal is going to actually dive into how do you find that information out, whether or not it actually meets.
All right, so like we said, in order to truly understand why color contrast is so important, we've actually got a Chrome extension that we're going to show you that lets you look at images, or in this case of the slide, graphs and charts with various levels of types of color blindness. So on this slide, the top right chart is how someone with typical vision would see it, no color blindness. And you're able to see that there's dark blue and light blue bars. However, if I apply a color blindness overlay to it, it actually gets the second chart on the bottom right. And if I told my students, hey, I need you to look at this chart and extrapolate the data from the dark blue lines, my student with color blindness cannot complete this assignment successfully at all because they don't see a dark blue line at all. But to give you an idea, as I pull up this add-on, watch the large swatch on the left and the different colors in it change as I adjust through different types of color blindness. So someone who has blue cone, monochromancy, green weak, green blind, red weak, red blind, blue weak, and blue blind. So you start to get kind of an idea about why it's so important to not identify things by color alone. Often we'll see someone come in where they've made a schedule for their students, and maybe they teach the course Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Tuesday, Thursdays. And on their schedule, they'll say, well, if you're in the Monday, Wednesday, Friday section, you're going to complete the red. And if you're in the Tuesday, Thursday, you're going to complete the green. But what if this is how you see? What if you don't see any colors? Or the red and green on here is very different than the red and green on there. So this is why it's so important to make sure you're not using colors the only way. And so we really do recommend generating a good color palette before you start, because good pedagogy, good instructional design starts with accessibility in mind. And we say it all the time, it is much, much, much easier and much more time efficient to build accessibly from the start than have to remediate, even if you're having to learn the tools as you go. And so we're going to say this tool called Color Safe. And what Color Safe does is it lets you generate a color palette before you start working. And as you're selecting your colors, you really want to ensure that you're selecting probably no more than 3 colors, because just like font, which we'll talk about shortly, every time you switch colors and every time you switch fonts, your students or anybody you're looking at the document has to change their processing. And so if I use Color Safe, I'm able to tell it get started, and I can tell it, well, I already know a color I want. So I'm going to put the hex code in there. And I'm going to tell it, well, this is the font I plan on using. So I use Georgia a lot in my own stuff. And I'm going to tell it, well, this is the size. And do I want to meet AA or AAA standards? And when I select Generate Color Palette, it's going to give me every color that meets contrast with the color I gave it. And it is important to keep in mind, just because a color meets contrast doesn't mean it's a good match. So you do want to go, okay, yeah, those colors do technically meet contrast, but they don't make a pretty match. And maybe I know, okay, that was a dark blue I put in, I want a gray to go with it. I can immediately jump to all the grays that work with it. Or if I want an orange, which an orange really will not match that blue that I put in. But I'm able to jump. And so let's say this is the color I want. I want this kind of goldenrod color. All I have to do is click on the square and it copies it for me, and it gives me a preview of what that color is going to look like at the top in text. So I'm able to kind of look at it. It gives me the contrast ratio. So I put in the hex code for a dark blue. This goldenrod meets the ratio, and it meets II standards. So it takes that guesswork out. Another way to do this is if you are remediating content, you need to check and make sure if your colors work together. So I'm going to put, let's say I'm going to use our institution's colors. That is our dark blue. So I put in the hex code for our dark blue, and then I'm going to put in the hex code EA 98C5 EA. And it tells me, it automatically tells me, gives me that contrast ratio Kristen was talking about earlier, and it gives me a visual identifier to know if it passed or not. Now let's make an example here. So let's say those were the two numbers I put in. I said, this is my background color and this is my foreground color. Those don't pass. In fact, they fail. I can take this little slider bar under each one and I can adjust it until I find a color that meets the contrast standards. Additionally, if you click on the little bars that are just to the right of each of the hex codes, you can put in the RGB, and you also have a slider in there to kind of help you determine if you don't have a color in mind. Oh, well, I'm looking for a blue, and I could say I want that one, and it'll get updated for me. So I can just say, go ahead, I want that one now. So this is a great tool. It's free. It doesn't cost you anything to use it, and it's very user friendly. And it takes, because whenever we start talking about those contrast ratios, everyone glazes over a little bit because it's a lot of math. And so it takes that guesswork out for you. And another thing to think about when you're making a slide deck is the fonts that you're using. And this is something that a lot of people don't spend time thinking about when they're working on generating a slide deck. And there actually is even debate in the disability community if a serif or sans serif font is better. There's no consensus. Because of this, when you're selecting a font to use, there's several things you want to think about. Serifs are those little decorative tails and that stem from the strokes of letters. So if we look at the slide, the title of the slide is a serif font. It's got the little tails under each letter. But if I look at the font that we're using for the headers on the slide itself, those are sans serif fonts. Serifs are slightly more readable than sans serifs are slightly more readable than serif fonts. And you want to make sure there's a clear distinction between the letters when you're selecting your fonts. Such as Ariel is considered a very accessible font, but we'll talk about why there's a problem with it in a minute. There is not a best typeface. We can't tell you, okay, you need to use Times New Roman. There unfortunately is not a best typeface. But that also gives you some freedom too, right? Because you're making your course content and you want it to be your own. And so either way, when you're thinking about fonts, you want to select something that is simplistic and is readable. And so your fonts should use similar, familiar, parsed fonts. You want to avoid complex characters such as cursive scripts. A lot of times we'll see things coming in cursive and that's not accessible. You want to make sure you're avoiding ambiguous characters, such as a font where maybe the letter O and a 0 are very similar, or a C is nearly closed, so it looks like an O. And you want to use limited numbers of fonts. Every time you swap, the reader has to adjust their reading pattern. So we really don't suggest more than 3 fonts in a presentation. You want to consider the spacing and weight. Fonts that have very little spacing between letters are really hard to read. And suddenly the word cool might look like the word cod, and that's very different. Additionally, if you've got a font that's very light, it might be difficult to differentiate those letters. And if you've got something that's got the letters very close together, that's going to be hard to read. But also, if they're too far apart, they might look like separate words altogether. And again, you want to, just like we said with images, you want to make sure you're getting that sufficient contrast between your colors. And you definitely want to avoid small size font. For a presentation, you probably 18 would be the absolute smallest. 24 is kind of more on the recommended route. When you're formatting your fonts within your documents, you want to make sure you're avoiding all caps. When you use all caps and someone's using a screen reader, the screen reader will actually read out each individual letter versus reading the word. So for example, the title on this slide is serif versus sans serif, and that's how the screen reader would read it. But if I had put it in all caps, it would say SERIF VS SANS SERIF. By the time I got through probably the second word, you'd already lost me. And so that's why it's very important to make sure you're really reserving all caps just for acronyms. When you're using abbreviations, you have to make sure they make sense to someone who can't see them. For example, we see it a lot on schedules. Someone will abbreviate the month of September as SEPT. Well, a screen reader is going to read that as SEPT. They're not going to know this is an abbreviation for September. If you're using an acronym, you have to provide both the full spelling and the acronym on first use. So for example, if I was going to abbreviate the FBI, I would want to say Federal Bureau of Investigation, and then in parentheses say FBI. And then I'm more than welcome to use the acronym of FBI throughout the entire document. Special characters cannot be read by most screen readers. You should never, ever use a special character in place of a bullet. You want to make sure you're using the built-in formatting. A lot of times we'll see, well, somebody's taken like an emoji and replaced their bullets with just emojis on each line. That doesn't work, because when you use the built-in formatting, when a user using a screen reader comes to it, the screen reader actually announces it. So it'll say, bulleted list with 3 items, and then read the 3 items. If you've used something in place of the bullet and you haven't used the formatting, the user's never going to know. Underlines should only be used for URLs. For users with color blindness or low vision, they may have trouble distinguishing links from regular text without that underline. And finally, like we've said before, color should never be the only indicator. If someone has that color blindness or low vision, they're not going to be able to ascertain the information. Additionally, somebody who has certain types of disabilities, they might actually override your color settings to use a setting that works best for them. So what was blue on your screen may be red on their screen. And so we said, there's no good typical font, and we've given you a nice selection here, but this is not all of them. This is just a small sampling. So any of these would be appropriate, but there's also ones that aren't on this list that are appropriate. We just wanted to give you a list to work with to get you an idea. And then Ariel or not Ariel. A lot of people swear by Ariel. They're like, oh, it's the most popular sans serif font. But here's the problem with it. Which one's the lowercase L and which one's the capital I? Looking at the screen, you have no clue. I would actually have to go change the font to figure it out myself. And so when you're assessing student work, which is often not polished, being able to tell the difference between a typo and a legitimate error is important. Inversely, you're teaching your students new concepts, so they need to be able to clearly distinguish between your letters also. And then finally, there is a font called Dyslexi, and it was created by someone who had dyslexia to help people who have dyslexia. But even in the accessibility community, people can't agree if this is a good font or not, as some people who have dyslexia have a hard time processing it also. And it's not free. It costs about $60 per individual.
We're going to also be discussing alternative text today. Alternative text is required for any image that's not decorative, that's required for the context and understanding of your subject material. It should also be added for any tables, and your alternative text should not include phrases such as image of or picture of, as a screen reader is going to identify that it is reading the alternative text of an image. So this information is actually repetitive. If there is any text within your image, it's also needing to be included within your alternative text. Finally, if an image has a caption, the alternative text must not match the image caption. But how do you determine whether or not an image is decorative or not? Many people incorrectly think that an accessible presentation can't have any images. This isn't the case. In fact, you can still add decorative images. As you see throughout our presentation, we have lots of Kermit the Frog doing different things. Deciding if something is decorative is entirely up to you, the creator of the presentation. Images that are decorative are visual styling, such as borders. So we have a purple border around this, so that's technically decorative. Supplemental to improve the appearance. Illustrative, but not contributing to the content, it's just visually appealing. Or it is described by the surrounding text on the slide. Short descriptions should be used whenever possible for alternative text. Alternative text may interrupt the flow of reading, so it's important to keep it concise. You want to provide equivalent access to the image, but do so without burdening the reader. So in general, you should use only a phrase or a sentence or two to describe what is being conveyed from the image that you are, or non-text element that you are providing, that they need to understand for your content. However, a long description text will interrupt the screen reader and make it difficult for an individual to process or understand that full concept. So you must label, if you are going to use a long description, the alternative text as a long description. You also have a couple other options. You can create alternative text that provides the essential information that's needed to provide context. You can also provide a short description within the alternative text and to add the context, and then a long description can appear somewhere else on the page, or in some cases you might link out to it like a Google Doc or something else if it's going to be overwhelming for other people, or there's not enough space, as we talk about slide representation or slide success in a minute. And then you might also come into some complex images. Images such as chemistry molecules with angles that require enough detail to adequately understand the concept. However, they shouldn't overwhelm an individual, and writing this can be very difficult. However, it's important to note that some publishers or open educational resources such as OERs may already have alt text that you can use with their permission. And we have also come across, as you saw, we had a simple bar chart earlier. Identifying that in 1 to 2 sentences, even with 2 simple bars, can be difficult. So in some cases, you might not actually tell them every single piece of data. You might actually provide, because this wouldn't be visual to other learners if they're not using a screen reader. This is for somebody who can't see it, what they need to interpret from that data, because they can't make that interpretation if they can't see it.
All right. So slide success for 7x7. The 7x7 rule prevents you from putting too much information on a slide. And this is going to help both your students with disabilities and without. This helps everybody. You want your slide to be brief, plain, and concise. It should never be a paragraph or a wall of text. The idea is that your viewer will be able to quickly glance at your slide and gain all of the information. Each slide should have no more than 7 lines, and each line should have no more than 7 words per line. Reading a paragraph off a slide is not how your students learn. It's not how you learn. Think about if you were in a meeting and somebody popped in a slide that looked like this. You wouldn't be listening to them at all. You would be reading the slide. You should not be looking to read your entire slide for a presentation. This slide is meant to reinforce and guide your presentation and never be a verbatim copy of your lecture. Slides should only be used to emphasize a point. They're to keep you on track. They're to illustrate a point with a graphic. Creating your presentation slides with too much text is overwhelming. Writing what you're going to say word for word will not have the intended effect on comprehension. In fact, put yourself in your students' shoes for a minute. If they open a slide deck and it's 40 slides long and each slide is a paragraph, they're not going to be excited to engage with your content, because if we're honest, you wouldn't be either if someone sent you that. And so you want to make sure you are, instead of instead, the audience's kind of auditory and visual processing channels are going to be used within viewing a slide deck. You know, they're trying to read and they're trying to listen. And if your slide is doing too much, they're not going to be able to do both. Each channel has limited working memory capacity. This is known as the dual channel theory. And it really is the best practice to use the 7x7 rule, which is 7 bullets with 7 words per line maximum. And expanding on each visual text via your narration for each slide. The audience is going to be more engaged. They're going to know that they need to listen. And they know that there's going to be more available to them than is on the slide. Because if you sit there and your students realize that you're just going to read this slide to them, they're not going to listen to you. And so if you need more than 7 words per line, you should break your line up and make a subpoint. And this isn't a hard and fast rule. You know, if you've got, you know, a list of 8 words that are just single words, that's okay. This isn't a hard and fast rule. This is a guideline. And again, please never place entire paragraphs of text on a slide, because your audience is just not going to learn from that. Your audience should be able to ascertain what's on your slide in seconds. If it takes them more than 30 seconds to read everything on the slide, it's far too complex and you need to break it up. But this slide is actually the majority of what we talked about on the last slide, but in a wall of text. And our little frogs are not happy. And so a good idea is, before you even get started, to have a firm idea in mind and consider your students' experiences. Again, that PowerPoint should not be many, many slides long. Probably, I imagine most of us have been in the situation where we went to a meeting and we got the slide deck beforehand and it was 100 slides long, and none of us were excited to go to that meeting. And so, you know, you want to consider that your users will not sit through a 3-hour PowerPoint in one sitting. They're not going to do it. Based on research, student engagement decreases substantially after 4 to 7 minutes. You have to remember, our typical 18 to 22-year-olds, our traditional students, are the TikTok generation. They get everything in 3 minutes or less. And so you really want to limit that number of slides, and you want to chunk your material into subtopics, 7 to 10 minutes max length. If you're using pictures, make sure you do have the permission to use them, or that you have obtained them either under the Creative Commons license, or if you're using publisher images, that you have permission in writing to use them. And you really want to avoid slide animations. I knew they were cool when they first came out and everybody loved them. However, they're distracting even for your typically able students. And for your students with disabilities, they can be extremely disruptive to their learning process. Having animations that require multiple clicks is difficult for your students who are using assistive technology.
Slide titles. We mentioned this earlier when we were talking about placeholders. This is something that you should have on your master slides or within your theme builder. Slide titles actually provide a user with clear navigation throughout the document and also helps you to organize. So when you're creating slide titles, it's imperative that your titles are succinct, clear, and to the point. You should never replicate slide titles. So for instance, this slide is called slide titles. We should not have another slide titled slide titles within the same deck. If I needed to use the same title, like I was continuing on with an example of something, I should number the slide titles, for instance, slide title 1 of 3, to make it clear which slide is which. The reason for avoiding duplicate slide titles is someone using a screen reader to review a slide deck cannot differentiate between which slide is which if all of the slides or some of the slides have identical titles. Additionally, full-size image or video slides still need a title. And you can accomplish this by simply dragging the title off the slide or leaving it behind the image or video, so those using assistive technologies can differentiate and navigate throughout your slide deck. And the last piece that we are going to talk about is about the accessibility checkers that many of you have available. Well, we know that there are tools to check accessibility. The reality is that's not the best place to start, as Crystal and I have mentioned throughout this presentation. it is nearly always more work for you to actually remediate an inaccessible document than it is for you to build it accessibly from the start. And as Crystal mentioned before, even if this means that you are learning the accessibility piece as you build. While you might have access to accessibility checkers within a program or as an add-on, we don't really want to encourage you to use that as your starting point. You should see the accessibility checkers as a polishing tool, just like spell check. If you're relying on the accessibility checker, you are definitely missing something, because it is just a tool. Just like every other tool, you have to know how to use it and how it's supposed to function. So it might tell you you have an accessibility error, but if you don't understand the error, you won't have any idea to fix it. And in some cases, it might tell you you have an accessibility error and you don't. But if you don't understand the accessibility piece, you won't know when it is actually telling you correctly. But it does help to guide you to remediate some of your documents. Many of the programs you're already using have accessibility tools to help you build or remediate your content. Microsoft has actually made a 5-year commitment to helping decrease the gap in accessible technology, and they've made great strides to ensure all the tools in Office 365 suite will help users check and generate accessible documents. We are currently using Google Slides today, and there is an add-on called Grackle. This can be used for Google Docs, Google Sheets, and Google Slides. There are 3 different ones that can be added on to each of those. It helps take the guesswork out of making your course materials accessible. And a subscription is actually very cost effective. It costs less than $1,000 for an entire domain. So every user within a domain would have access. So if you're at an institution or a school district that uses Google for education, suggesting the purchase of this add-on could be beneficial for not only you as faculty, but for staff and students at your school as well. And I believe Crystal has some items pulled up so she can show you these different tools. So if you do have, items you've already created, you can go back and remediate, but building accessible, material just from the get-go is going to be better than just using this tool alone.
So I actually opened this is one of the templates that comes standard in PowerPoint 365. And I like this one as an example because everybody's like, oh, the template has to be accessible, right? No, it's not. And so if I'm in PowerPoint and I go to the review tab, there's a button that says check accessibility. And again, all I did was open the template before we got on the webinar. I didn't change anything. And it immediately tells me, hey, there is hard to read text in contrast. And so it will actually take me to, yep, those don't match. Those don't work. It will take me to where the colors are. And it shows me, hey, these are where you need to fix things. And that's a contrast error. And so if I wanted to get that over there, get this here, let's drop these in WebAIM. And so if I wanted to check my colors, and I want more colors, tell me what color that is. So that was pure white. That's an easy one to check. And then I need what this blue is. It's in table design. Shading. It's going to be difficult to tell me. More colors. There we go. And so I'm going to steal that hex code out. And I'm going to put that into the contrast checker. And we get the contrast that it fails. This was 2.6 to 1. So and that's how you would remediate your own documents. When you run that accessibility checker, you just have to kind of take those steps. And this
Crystal, sorry, can you go back to WebAIM real quick? Because you actually swap the foreground and background, but there's a really easy way, even though the contrast ratio will stay the same, if you accidentally do that, there's that arrow in between foreground and background. If you notice it doesn't look the way that you were trying to find out.
But this is why it's really good to build your custom colors before you get started. Because if I had gone through it, let's pretend this wasn't a template. Let's pretend this was a slide deck I had made entirely. I would then have to go back and redo it. And if I had picked colors that worked at the start, I wouldn't have this problem now. It's telling me to check the reading order of slide 3, and that's going to, and it also, this is a nice thing to point out, it gives you a little blurb to try to kind of get you in the right direction. And if I click that read more, it gives me a help pane, and it's like, hey, you can go through and check this. And so it does give you some ideas. It does give you some guidance. And so get out of that. I want to work on my reading order. And so reading order, in case you're not familiar with what that is, reading order is what tells the screen reader, hey, this is the order in which the slide should be read. And so I can verify the order. I can go, is this the order in which I want this slide to be read? And so I would need to go through, it's telling me particularly slide 10. It's like, do you want me to read that title? Yes, first, yes, please. But then I've got these pictures up here, it's noted. I probably don't need it to read those pictures at all. They look very decorative to me. So I can actually in Microsoft tell it, hey, please don't read these pictures to anybody, because they are just visual. And so that's kind of one of those important things to think about, is that visual doesn't mean not accessible. You just have to know how to make it right. Now, if I go back to my slide deck, which is somewhere, there it is. If I go back to my slide deck, I can run what's called Grackle and Grackle Slides, and I hit launch and it runs, and it takes it just a minute, and it's going to run a series of checks on my slide deck. It's trying. There we go. And you'll notice we have all pass right now, except for a couple places. It says, here's an example of where Kristen said earlier, you have to know how to use the tool, because sometimes it's going to say things don't work that do work. And if I go to this rectangle, pull me to it, it's saying this dark purple on white doesn't work. I know it does, but just for the sake of example, it certainly passes. So this is, again, why you have to kind of think of the accessibility tools as a polishing tool like spell check, and not so much as a crutch to rely on. Because sometimes if you didn't know how to check these colors, you'd be like, well, maybe I need to change it. So these are things to think about, and it will take me to each one. Now, it has flagged this pure green on white, which does not pass. We know doesn't pass. But again, you just have to kind of be knowledgeable when you look at it. It's telling me, well, the style's changed. Yes, because it went from bold to a standard font, because someone using a screen reader, they don't know. It doesn't announce to them if you've changed to a bold font or if you've changed the color of your font. They don't have a way to know that. The screen reader doesn't say, hey, this is now bold. So if you're just bolding text to make a point to your students, that's not going to help them. If you're telling them, I want you to complete the bold assignment, they're not going to know. Also on this, we have slide structure, and I can go through and I can verify, does each slide read in the order in which I intended it? And if I click on, so if I click the center title there, it's actually going to take a second, and it's going to pull me to it. So I'm able to kind of click through and go, which piece is this talking about? So if you're not sure, it will tell you, it'll show you. And for example, this QR code is an image, and it automatically pulls me to, hey, I need to tag it. Well, it was already tagged, but if it wasn't, it's giving me the prompt to do it. So it's immediately bringing you to the tool that lets you do it, just like was in PowerPoint.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Were you done, or were you going to continue on? There was a question that came through that we probably can go through with the slides themselves.
So let's answer it.
So they're asking specifically about how to use the same title for more than one slide.
Okay, so that's actually, do we have that in this deck? I think we do.
I don't know that we do. I think we changed the title, actually.
I think we did too. So I think we did also. So let's say I had, just for the sake of example, I had 2 links to materials. I probably wouldn't, but let's say for the sake of example, I did. Maybe I had 2 resource slides at the end. That's certainly probably something a lot of people get. So I could say link to materials 1 of 2. And then on the second one, I would say link to materials 2 of 2. And so that's just how you identify to somebody who's using that assistive technology that there's going to be more than one, because you have to imagine, you have to put yourself in the space of, they can't see it. They're relying on the screen reader to navigate for them. And so if they can't see it, you have to distinguish that difference for them. Where, you know, your 2 slides like look very different to somebody who can see, but if you can't see, you're not going to know that difference. And this is also helpful if you're using outlines in your PowerPoints, which you definitely should. Those are good for both your typically abled and students with disabilities. That will actually help them kind of navigate through the outline too. Because if you think about it, if you were making an outline, you're going to make sure your A, your B, your C are all different because that's good outline structure. So it's the same kind of thought process there.
Crystal, on the topic of slide titles, so something that we didn't totally harp on, but when we talked about using the master slides or theme builder, that means actually having those slide title placeholders there, not just adding text boxes or objects later. Because what happens is when you add them after the fact, they actually go to the bottom of your read order automatically, and you might have to end up reordering how it's being read. So that's why it's so important to actually use placeholders instead of just adding items to the actual slides. Or even if you have a slide layout, adding to it after the fact, it's better to actually create another layout with those additional pieces.
But these are those placeholders we're talking about in Google Slides. I just went to view and I went to theme builder, and then the T, it's kind of on the top left. I can click just a random text box, a title placeholder, a subtitle placeholder, and a body text placeholder. And those are, when we're talking about placeholders, that's what we're talking about, because that's going to help somebody using assistive technology navigate through their document.
So I just wanted to jump in real quick. We are right up on our time, but I actually had a quick question that I thought of after I saw that previous one. I was just curious about. So with the with those slide headers, you were giving the examples that they had the same name, doing 1 of 2, 2 of 2. If there was only 2 slides, would something that was, if it was like resources and then resources continued, would that be something that would be fine, or is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just something to distinguish. You could use, you know, resource A, resource B, just something that shows it's different.
Perfect. Thank you.
And then we do have, if you are interested, we did also do it in the Q&A. I will throw the link presentation, but that will also, I know Hawks will add that to when they actually post the recording as well. But if you didn't get it earlier, I did also just put it in chat. And we are, you know, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A. But if you are interested and have any other questions, feel free to reach out to us. And we also have our Twitter handles up as well.
Perfect. Thank you both so much. So we are a little past our time, but I'll say another quick thank you to both Crystal and Kristen. That was extremely interesting. And thank you to everyone who attended so far. I really do appreciate that. So now our next session is actually going to be our lunch keynote speaker. So you can view that chat for the next, you can view the chat for the next meeting room link, or to access the conference website for a complete list of concurrent sessions and the descriptions for the rest of the day. I'll be posting those links in just a second. And one quick additional thing, while accessing the conference website, please don't forget to swing by the exhibit hall if you have not already. You can say hello to the entire Hawks team. And if you view a quick 5-minute demonstration, you'll be entered to win one of our hourly giveaways, which are going to be your choice of a 6-month subscription to Audible, a 1-year subscription to Disney Plus, or a $100 Amazon gift card. So really great prizes for 5 minutes of your time. Really encourage you to go check out the exhibit hall. And on that note, we'll see you all at the next session. And for everyone in here, there will not be a session in this room for the next hour. So if you do want to view that keynote for lunch, you'll need to follow the links that I am pasting in the chat right now.